I thought my retirement at the lake house would be a quiet final chapter. But when my son-in-law backed his oversized SUV into my driveway and unloaded 4 massive suitcases, announcing his parents were moving in, the silence ended. I did not scream. I did not throw them out. I simply smiled, helped them carry their bags inside, and waited. When my new house guests began tearing down pictures of my late wife that very night, to modernize the space they thought they were claiming their new territory, they had no idea they had just walked into a perfectly engineered trap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who mistook your silence for weakness. My name is Warren. I am 68 years old, and for 40 years I worked as a supply chain logistics director for a major shipping corporation. My entire career was built on a single premise: identify the anomaly, assess the risk, and neutralize the threat efficiently. When I retired, I traded international shipping ports for the tranquil shores of Lake Lanier in Georgia. This house was my late wife Diane's masterpiece. She designed every square foot of it before cancer took her 5 years ago. The floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water, the wrap-around cedar deck, the open kitchen. It was meant to be our sanctuary. Now it is just mine. I was on the deck that Tuesday morning drinking my coffee and watching the mist roll off the lake when the tranquility shattered. The crunch of gravel echoed down the driveway, followed by the aggressive revving of an engine. It was a brand new luxury SUV, the kind with a lease payment that probably equaled a mortgage. My son-in-law Trent threw the car into park and stepped out. My daughter Rachel emerged from the passenger side. She looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a 60-hour work week under her eyes. Trent, however, looked incredibly pleased with himself. Before I could even set my coffee mug down, the back doors opened. Out stepped Gideon and Beatrice Trent's parents. I had only met them a handful of times since the wedding. They were the kind of people who wore designer clothes with visible logos and spoke loudly in restaurants to ensure everyone knew they were there. Trent popped the trunk and began hauling out 4 massive hard-shell suitcases. He dropped them on my porch with a heavy thud. Warren, Trent said, clapping his hands together with artificial enthusiasm. "Great news! Mom and Dad are going to be staying with us for a while." "Well, staying with you. We figured the lake air would be good for them." I looked at the suitcases. Then I looked at Rachel. She avoided my gaze, staring down at her shoes. She was trembling slightly. Trent had clearly ambushed her with this plan just as he was ambushing me. Gideon adjusted his golf shirt and stepped forward, not offering a handshake. "We had a slight hiccup with an overseas real estate investment," Gideon announced, waving his hand as if dismissing a minor inconvenience. "Just a temporary liquidity issue. Trent generously offered your guest wing. It makes sense. You have all this empty space, and quite frankly, living alone at your age is depressing." Beatrice pushed past him, her eyes already scanning the exterior of the house with a critical squint. "It is very rustic," she noted, her tone suggesting rustic was a disease. "But we can make it work for a few months. I suppose I will need to call a service to deep clean the guest bathroom before I use it. For 40 years, I dealt with hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive union negotiations. I knew the anatomy of an invasion. Trent was not asking for a favor. He was establishing a foothold. He knew Rachel was too tired to fight him, and he assumed I was just a lonely, passive old man who would be grateful for the company. If I screamed and kicked them out right then, Trent would weaponize it. He would convince Rachel that her father was a hostile, unreasonable old man, fracturing my relationship with my daughter to isolate her further. A good logistician never reacts to an ambush. He absorbs the data and prepares the countermeasure. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I gave Trent a calm, unreadable smile. "Of course," I said, picking up the heaviest suitcase. "Let me help you get these inside. The guest rooms are down the hall to the left." Trent smirked, shooting a triumphant look at his father. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully dominated the territory. The rest of the day was a masterclass in entitlement. Gideon immediately claimed the leather recliner facing the television. demanding the volume be turned up because he refused to wear his hearing aids. Beatrice commandeered my kitchen, rearranging Diane's meticulously organized spice rack because the feng shui was wrong. Rachel pulled me aside in the hallway before she and Trent left to return to the city. "Dad, I am so sorry," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Trent told me this morning. They lost their condo. He promised it is only for a few weeks until they secure a new lease. Please, I just do not have the energy to fight him right now." I hugged her tightly. "Do not worry about me, Rachel. Focus on yourself. I can handle Gideon and Beatrice." She drove away with Trent, leaving me alone with the parasites. Dinner was a silent affair. I cooked a simple roast chicken. Beatrice picked at it, mentioning loudly that her son usually took them to fine dining steakhouses on Tuesdays. Gideon complained about the water pressure in the guest bathroom. I just chewed my food, watching them analyzing their patterns, collecting my baseline data. I went to my master suite early that evening, feigning fatigue. Around midnight, I felt a familiar thirst and walked out into the dark hallway to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As I passed the living room, I noticed the soft glow of a floor lamp. Beatrice was standing by the mantel over the stone fireplace. The mantel was sacred. It held a chronological history of my life with Diane. Our wedding photo pictures from our trips to the national parks, and a beautiful candid shot of Diane laughing on the very deck outside. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as Beatrice systematically picked up each silver frame. She did not just look at them. She placed them face down in a cardboard box she had found in the pantry. "We need to make this permanent," she whispered to Gideon, who was sitting on the sofa scrolling through his phone. "Tomorrow I am going to buy some modern abstract art to cover these holes. All these dead people staring at me gives the room a morbid energy. If we are going to be living here, it needs to reflect our status, not some depressing memorial." Gideon grunted in agreement. "Trent says the old man goes to bed by 9. We practically have the run of the place. Just box up the junk and put it in the garage." The urge to step into the light and physically throw them through the front door was a blazing fire in my chest. To hear my Diane referred to as a morbid energy, to watch a stranger dismantle her memory in the house she built. It took every ounce of my professional discipline to remain in the shadows. But I knew that reacting now with anger would only give them ammunition. They would play the victims. They would tell Rachel I was unstable and aggressive. I needed irrefutable, undeniable leverage. I turned around silently and walked back to my bedroom. I locked the door and opened my laptop. I did not buy abstract art. I navigated to a specialized security electronics distributor. I ordered 6 high-definition motion-activated micro-cameras. I selected the models that synced directly to a secure encrypted cloud server, accessible only from my private phone. I paid extra for overnight morning delivery. They thought they were moving into a free luxury resort. They thought they had sidelined a helpless old widower. But they had not breached a retirement home. They had stepped into a monitored, controlled environment. The perimeter was compromised and the surveillance protocol was now active. The delivery truck arrived exactly at 9 in the morning, just as I had anticipated. Gideon and Beatrice had already left for a bottomless brunch downtown, a luxury outing they casually expected me to finance before I politely declined their absurd invitation. As soon as the tires of Trent's leased vehicle crunched out of sight down the long gravel driveway, I sprang into action. There was no time for hesitation. The package contained 6 micro-cameras of the highest industrial grade available on the market today. I did not place them haphazardly around the house. I installed them with the precision of a seasoned tactician securing a hostile zone against an incoming enemy threat. One camera went inside the living room smoke detector, positioned carefully to capture the entire seating area and the front door. One slipped behind the kitchen valance, offering a perfect unobstructed angle of the marble island and the refrigerator. Another was integrated seamlessly into the hallway thermostat facing the bedrooms. They were completely undetectable to the naked eye, wired directly to an encrypted cloud server that pinged straight to a secure application on my private mobile device. I tested the audio feed from the kitchen camera first. It was sensitive enough to capture the faintest whisper over the low hum of the appliances. I finished the installation process in exactly 45 minutes, methodically sweeping away any drywall dust and returning my tools to their proper place in the garage. When my unwanted guests returned 3 hours later, complaining loudly about the service at the local bistro, the digital net was already fully operational. They walked right into it, completely blind, to the fact that their every move was now being recorded. Watching Trent strut through my front door, jingling the keys to a European sports utility vehicle he definitively does not own, reminded me of everything I have always despised about the man. Trent is a masterful architect of the illusion of wealth. He leases absolutely everything in his life. The luxury cars, the designer watches, the high-end tailored suits he wears to important meetings. He constantly projects an aura of immense success, while secretly carrying a massive mountain of toxic financial liabilities. Meanwhile, my beautiful daughter Rachel grinds through exhausting 60-hour weeks as a corporate financial analyst just to keep their heads above the rising water. She works until her eyes are bloodshot and her shoulders ache so Trent can maintain his expensive country club memberships and pitch his imaginary startup ventures to people who are just as fake and empty as he is. He is a financial vampire slowly draining my daughter's youth ambition and energy to fund his incredibly fragile ego. And now, having thoroughly drained his own bank accounts and ruined his credit score beyond repair, he has brought his lazy parents into my peaceful sanctuary to drain my resources. He actually thinks I do not see the quiet desperation hiding behind his arrogant smile. He thinks I am oblivious to the fact that they are running out of options and places to hide. The sheer audacity of their entitlement surfaced less than 48 hours after their initial arrival. I returned from a quiet morning walk along the edge of the lake to find my master bedroom door standing wide open. Gideon was standing by my solid oak dresser, casually unpacking his cheap golf polos into my personal clothing drawers. Beatrice was tossing my expensive Egyptian cotton sheets into a plastic laundry basket, complaining loudly about the color scheme being too depressing. I stood frozen in the doorway and asked them exactly what they thought they were doing in my private space. Gideon immediately grabbed his left knee, a sudden and miraculous limp appearing out of thin air. He groaned dramatically, stating that the wooden stairs leading up to the guest wing were simply too much for his aging joints, and that the master suite on the ground floor was a strict medical necessity for his health. Trent walked into the room precisely at that moment, smelling of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. He stepped directly between me and his father, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. "Come on," Warren Trent sighed, adopting a patronizing tone usually reserved for scolding unruly toddlers. "Do not make a huge deal out of this situation. Stop being so rigid. Dad has bad knees and you are a perfectly healthy guy. The guest room upstairs has a perfectly fine bed. You are supposed to be helping family right now, not fighting us over a mattress." I looked at Trent. I looked at Gideon's magically failing knee. A lesser man would have thrown punches right there. A lesser man would have screamed and called the local police to remove trespassers from his property. But I am a retired auditor. I know that when dealing with corporate espionage, you never reveal you are onto the thieves until you have them cornered in a room with absolutely nowhere to run. I simply nodded, gathered my clothes in complete silence, and moved my belongings to the tiny guest room upstairs. They exchanged victorious smirks behind my back. They thought they had broken my spirit. They thought the old man was soft submissive and easily bullied into submission. That night, the house was completely quiet. The usurpers were sleeping soundly in the very bed Diane and I had shared for decades. I sat alone in the small guest room, with the door locked tight, the cold glow of my tablet illuminating the dark space. I opened the encrypted security application and began reviewing the compiled footage from the kitchen cameras earlier that afternoon. The video resolution was crystal clear. The audio was absolutely immaculate. I watched Trent leaning against the marble kitchen island, casually sipping a large glass of my most premium aged scotch. Beatrice was standing right next to him, wiping down the countertops with a frantic, highly possessive energy. She looked at her son, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "You need to give him a month, Trent," Beatrice said smoothly, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "We will make him so uncomfortable, he will beg to move into an assisted living facility. The man is already a total pushover. He gave up his own bedroom today without a single fight. Once he is out of the picture and locked away in some nursing home, we can get him to sign over the deed. This lake house is easily worth $1 million. It is the perfect fresh start for us." Trent swirled the expensive scotch in his glass and laughed softly. He actually agreed with her. He told his mother that Rachel would be a little sad at first, but he would easily convince her that a medical facility was the absolute safest option for her aging, confused father. I sat in the dark guest room watching that highly incriminating footage replay on a continuous loop. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. The mild irritation I had felt just 2 days ago completely evaporated entirely, replaced by an absolute freezing clarity. This was no longer just a petty situation involving rude house guests or a stolen master bedroom. This was a calculated predatory plot to permanently displace me, force me into a medical institution, and steal the very last remaining piece of my late wife's beautiful legacy. They had officially crossed the line from inconvenient, annoying relatives to hostile invaders actively planning a massive financial coup. They fully believed I was a tired, defeated old man just waiting quietly for the end of my life. They did not know they had just declared war on a man who had spent his entire professional life systematically destroying corporate threats from the inside out. The initial observation phase had officially yielded its primary intelligence. The parasites had revealed their ultimate objective on camera. Now it was time for me to start laying the silent groundwork for their total and absolute destruction. The morning mist was still clinging to the surface of the lake when I guided my aluminum fishing boat back toward the private dock. It was a Tuesday, barely past 8 o'clock, and the air usually smelled only of pine needles and damp earth. Today, however, the tranquility was violently interrupted by the mechanical scream of a circular saw tearing through wood. I tied the boat off with practiced, methodical movements, listening as the aggressive sound echoed across the water. Someone was dismantling my property. I walked up the gentle slope of the backyard, my boots crunching softly against the gravel path. As I cleared the tree line, I saw the destruction. 2 men in neon work vests were actively ripping up the cedar planks of my wrap around deck, the very deck Diane and I had spent months designing to perfectly frame the sunset views. Planks of aged cedar were tossed carelessly onto my manicured lawn, exposing the foundational joists underneath. A heavy demolition dumpster was already parked precariously close to my wife's prized hydrangea bushes. I did not break into a run. I did not shout at the men to stop. I simply approached the foreman, who was reviewing a blueprint on the hood of his truck, and politely asked who had authorized this demolition. Before the foreman could answer, the sliding glass door opened, and Gideon stepped out onto the remaining intact section of the deck. He was wearing my plush cotton bathrobe, sipping coffee from a mug that had belonged to Diane, surveying the destruction with an infuriatingly proud expression. He looked down at me, holding up a hand to stop the workers for a moment. "Warren," my friend Gideon announced loudly, ensuring the contractors could hear his commanding tone. I told Trent this old deck was a massive liability. The wood was practically rotting. I took the liberty of hiring a crew to pour a concrete patio instead. It is going to add tremendous value to our property. The absolute audacity of the phrase "our property" hung in the crisp morning air like a toxic cloud. I looked at the foreman, who seemed slightly uncomfortable with the sudden tension. "I am the sole legal owner of this residence," I told the foreman in a calm, even voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "This man is a temporary guest. You are trespassing, and you are destroying private property without a permitted authorization from the deed holder. I suggest you pack your tools and leave the premises immediately before I involve the local authorities for vandalism." The foreman did not argue. He took one look at my cold, unwavering expression, signaled his crew, and began loading the trucks. Gideon turned bright red, sputtering indignities, and calling me an ungrateful old fool who could not handle necessary modern upgrades. I did not engage him. My mind was already moving 5 steps ahead. Gideon was arrogant, but he was not a mastermind. If he felt comfortable enough to hire contractors and call this his property, he had been given a reason to believe he had real authority. The parasite did not act alone. He was emboldened by a larger, more sinister scheme orchestrated by his son. I walked past Gideon, ignoring his escalating tantrums, and headed straight into the house. I locked the door to my private study behind me. For 4 decades, my professional life as a supply chain logistics director was not merely about moving cargo across oceans. My true expertise was forensic auditing. I was the man corporations called when millions of dollars vanished from international shipping manifests without a single trace. I hunted ghosts in corporate ledgers, exposed offshore shell companies, and tracked down executives who thought they had perfectly covered their tracks. I know exactly what a compromised system looks like. The signs of an intrusion are rarely loud. They are always found in the microscopic, seemingly insignificant details that an amateur overlooks. I scanned my study with the clinical eye of a seasoned investigator. The room appeared untouched, but the air felt disturbed. I approached my heavy steel filing cabinet tucked into the corner. To the untrained eye, the lock was perfectly intact. But when I crouched down and examined the metal cylinder, I saw the faint microscopic scratch marks along the brass housing. Someone had used a tension wrench and a picking tool to force the cylinder open. They had been inside my most sensitive personal records. I quickly opened the drawers, mentally inventorying the contents. My late wife's death certificate was there. My original property deed was there. But the folder containing my old tax returns and banking routing numbers had been slightly shifted out of alphabetical order. They had what they needed, but what exactly were they building? The answer arrived not from inside the house, but from the driveway. The distinct hum of a delivery truck engine caught my attention through the study window. A courier in a purple and orange uniform was walking up to the front porch, holding a thick, priority overnight envelope. I stepped out of the study and intercepted the courier before he could ring the doorbell, signing for the package myself. It was addressed to Trent, but the return address belonged to a major national bank headquartered in New York, the same bank where I held my primary checking account. I took the envelope back into my locked study. An amateur would have ripped it open, alerting the enemy that their communications were compromised. I am not an amateur. I used a specialized heating tool from my desk to carefully melt the adhesive seal on the cardboard envelope, opening it without leaving a single trace of tampering. I slid the thick stack of documents out onto my desk, and the true horrifying scope of Trent's master plan finally revealed itself in stark black and white ink. It was an official approval notice for a home equity line of credit commonly known as a HELOC. Trent had successfully applied for a massive loan of $150,000 using the massive equity I had built up in this lake house as collateral. My eyes scanned the intricately forged paperwork attached to the approval notice. There was a comprehensive financial application filled out with my stolen Social Security number, my manipulated tax history, and my exact banking details. But the most damning piece of paper was at the very bottom of the stack. It was a durable power of attorney document, granting Trent absolute unmitigated legal control over my entire financial estate. It stated clearly that due to my failing cognitive health, Trent was legally authorized to act on my behalf in all property and banking matters. At the bottom of the page sat my signature, masterfully forged right next to the stamp of a corrupt public notary who was clearly on Trent's payroll. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of his strategy became crystal clear. The master bedroom theft, the condescending remarks about my age, the incoming gaslighting of my daughter Rachel. Trent was not just trying to make me uncomfortable so I would move out. He was systematically establishing a documented history of my supposed mental decline. He wanted to drain $150,000 of hard-earned equity out of my home to pay off whatever massive toxic debts he was hiding. If I defaulted on the loan he secretly opened, the bank would foreclose on the house, leaving me homeless and penniless, while Trent and his parents walked away with the cash. They thought I was just a naive, exhausted old man who would simply fade into the background. They thought their forged paperwork was an impenetrable shield. I carefully photographed every single page of the fraudulent loan documents using my encrypted smartphone. Then, I painstakingly slid the papers back into the envelope, applied a microscopic layer of fresh adhesive, and sealed it so perfectly it looked completely untouched. I walked out to the kitchen and casually tossed the package onto the counter, right where Trent would expect to find his mail. I did not panic. I did not confront him. Confrontation is the weapon of the weak. Evidence is the weapon of the victorious. The parasite had just handed me the exact rope I needed to hang him. Now it was time to quietly sever his financial lifeline before he even realized the blade was swinging. I did not confront the man who was attempting to steal my home. Anger is a predictable emotion, and predictable men are easily defeated. Instead, I left the forged delivery envelope exactly where I had found it on the kitchen counter, grabbed my keys, and drove straight into the city. My destination was a sleek, glass-fronted building in the financial district home to Stuart Collins. Stuart was not just a lawyer. He was a ruthless legal architect who had helped my late wife Diane and me structure our estate decades ago. He was a man who appreciated the cold, hard mechanics of the law as much as I appreciated the logistics of global supply chains. When I walked into his mahogany-paneled office, Stuart greeted me with a firm handshake, expecting a routine update on my retirement. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed my encrypted smartphone on his desk and opened the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Trent's forged loan documents. I watched Stuart put on his reading glasses and lean in. For 3 unbroken minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of his grandfather clock. When he finally looked up, his professional demeanor had been completely replaced by a predator's focus. Warren Stuart said, his voice dropping an octave. "This is an application for a $150,000 home equity line of credit against your lake property. And this power of attorney document is a complete fabrication. The notary stamp belongs to a man who lost his license for real estate fraud 2 years ago. I can have the local authorities at your house to arrest your son-in-law before you even drive back. It is felony wire fraud and elder abuse." I shook my head slowly, looking out the massive window at the city skyline. "An arrest today is a minor inconvenience for a man like Trent," I explained. "He would hire a sleazy defense attorney, claim he was acting in my best interest, and try to drag my mental state into a prolonged, humiliating public court battle. He would spin a narrative that he was simply trying to secure funds for my medical care. No, Stuart. I do not want him simply arrested. I want his entire fraudulent reality completely dismantled. I want him to believe he has won right up until the exact second the floor collapses beneath his feet." Stuart leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He understood perfectly. "What is the objective, Warren?" he asked, picking up a gold pen. I outlined the silent trap. If Trent discovered the bank had rejected the forged power of attorney, he would panic and try to destroy the evidence. We needed him to feel absolutely secure, to act with the reckless confidence of a man who believes he has successfully outsmarted his target. Stuart picked up his desk phone and bypassed the regular customer service lines, dialing a direct number to the senior vice president of fraud investigations at my bank, a woman he had collaborated with for years. The conversation was brief, highly technical, and devastatingly effective. Stuart provided the loan application number from my photographs. They executed a ghost freeze on the account. On the bank's internal servers, the loan was flagged for severe criminal fraud, and the funds were locked in a secure holding pattern. However, on the consumer-facing portal, the very portal Trent would be checking obsessively from his smartphone, the status would remain brightly colored and clearly marked as approved and processing. If Trent attempted to initiate a wire transfer to pay off his massive hidden debts, the system would accept the command. "Show a pending transaction." but the money would simply vanish into a digital void, never reaching its destination. We effectively built a glass cage around him. He could see the money, he could reach for the money, but he would never be able to touch it. I left Stuart's office feeling a profound sense of operational control. The financial threat was neutralized. Now I needed to manage the human element. I drove the winding roads back to the lake house, preparing myself to face Gideon and Beatrice's insufferable entitlement for another evening. I expected to find them lounging on my deck or complaining about the water pressure again. Instead, when I walked through the heavy wooden front doors, the house was eerily silent. The television was off. The kitchen was empty. As I stepped into the living room, I heard a soft, muffled sound coming from the sofa. It was a sound that instantly bypassed the cold, analytical armor I had worn all day and struck directly at the heart of the father underneath. My daughter Rachel was sitting curled up in the corner of the sofa, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, desperate sobs. I hurried over to her, the logistical strategist vanishing, replaced entirely by a concerned parent. "Rachel, sweetheart, what is wrong?" I asked, sitting beside her and gently placing a hand on her back. She startled, wiping her tear-streaked face quickly, trying to compose herself. "Dad, I did not hear you come in." She stammered, her voice thick with exhaustion and sorrow. "I am fine. It is just work. The stress is just a lot right now." I knew it was not just work. Her eyes carried a specific kind of terror, a deep, unsettling grief that had nothing to do with corporate spreadsheets. I sat silently beside her, offering a calm, unmoving presence until the dam finally broke. "Dad," she whispered, looking at me with absolute heartbreak. "Trent and I had a long talk this morning before I went to the office. He is so worried about you. We both are. He told me about the things you have been doing, the things you are forgetting." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, though a cold fury began to ice my veins. "What things, Rachel?" She took a shaky breath, twisting a tissue in her hands. "He said you wandered out to the dock at 3 a.m. the other night and did not know how to get back to the house. He said he had to guide you inside. He told me you asked him when Mom was coming home from the grocery store. Dad, Mom has been gone for 5 years. He says you are leaving the stove on misplacing your wallet and becoming aggressive when he tries to help you." The sheer magnitude of Trent's psychological warfare laid itself bare before me. He was not just forging documents. He was actively, maliciously destroying my daughter's peace of mind. He was gaslighting his own wife, feeding her a carefully constructed narrative of my rapid cognitive decline. He needed Rachel to believe I was losing my mind, so that when he eventually produced the forged power of attorney, she would not question it. She would view it as a tragic necessity, a husband stepping up to handle a painful family crisis. I looked at my beautiful, hard-working daughter. The dark circles under her eyes, the trembling of her hands. She was carrying the crushing weight of believing she was slowly losing her father to dementia. Trent was weaponizing her love for me to facilitate his theft. Up until this exact moment, I had viewed the situation as a territorial dispute. Trent, Gideon, and Beatrice were parasites trying to claim my assets, and I was simply an auditor removing a threat. But sitting on that sofa watching my daughter weep over a fabricated tragedy, the paradigm shifted entirely. Rachel was not a quiet co-conspirator turning a blind eye to her husband's greed. She was a hostage in her own marriage, emotionally manipulated and systematically isolated by a sociopathic predator. I wanted to tell her the truth right then. I wanted to pull out the photos of the forged documents, to tell her about the frozen loan, to expose Trent's entire mountain of lies. But I looked at her exhausted face and knew that presenting her with that level of catastrophic betrayal right now, without the undeniable proof of Trent's incoming downfall, might simply break her completely. She needed to see the mask slip from his face with her own eyes. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a tight, grounding embrace. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady and exceptionally clear. "Look at me." She looked up, her tearful eyes searching my face. "I know you are carrying a tremendous amount of weight right now. I told her, speaking with deliberate, measured pacing. "But I need you to listen to me very carefully. My mind is as sharp as the day I retired. I know exactly what year it is. I know exactly where I am. And I know exactly what is happening in this house. Whatever Trent is telling you, I promise you, you do not need to mourn me yet." She blinked, confusion warring with a desperate, flickering hope. "But Trent says a lot of things," I interrupted gently. "Just trust me, Rachel. Trust your father. Over the next few days, many things are going to happen. It might get loud. It might get very confusing. But I promise you, I have everything under absolute control. You are going to be safe." I held her as she cried, her tears slowly turning from grief to a quiet, bewildered relief. The line had been drawn. The silent trap was fully armed at the bank, ticking down to its inevitable conclusion. But my objective was no longer just protecting my home and my equity. My objective was to completely and permanently eradicate Trent from my daughter's life, and I was going to ensure he destroyed himself in the process. The smell woke me instantly. It was 2 a.m, and the house was wrapped in the deep, heavy silence that only exists by the lake. But my senses were entirely focused on the sharp, rotten egg odor creeping under the door of the guest room. Mercaptan, the chemical additive they put in natural gas to make it detectable to the human nose. I lay perfectly still in the dark, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. For most people, the smell of gas is alarming. For me, it was a paralyzing, calculated psychological assault. My beautiful wife, Diane, did not just pass away. She died 5 years ago from severe smoke inhalation during a sudden electrical fire at our previous home in the city. The memory of that suffocating, invisible fog is something I carry every single day. Beatrice knew this. During their first week here, she had casually asked about Diane's passing over dinner, feigning polite sympathy while her eyes studied my reaction. Now, in the dead of night, the air in my home was slowly turning into a toxic, highly flammable cloud. I did not panic. I slipped out of bed, keeping my breathing shallow, and opened my bedroom door. The concentration of gas in the upstairs hallway was faint, but as I moved silently down the wooden staircase, the odor became thick and suffocating. The moonlight reflecting off the lake illuminated the open concept living space. I moved with the quiet urgency of a man who knows exactly how many minutes he has before a stray spark from the refrigerator compressor ignites the entire property. I walked directly into the kitchen. There, on the large stainless steel range, all 5 burner knobs were turned completely to the open position. The pilot lights had not been ignited. Raw, unburned gas was pouring freely into the enclosed space of my home. I reached out and twisted all 5 knobs back to the off position. The hissing sound immediately stopped. I moved through the first floor like a ghost, unlocking the large sliding glass doors and pushing them wide open to let the crisp night air purge the poison from the house. I stood on the back deck, filling my lungs with the clean breeze, letting my racing heart return to a steady operational rhythm. This was not a careless mistake. You do not accidentally push and twist 5 separate safety knobs on a professional grade range. This was an assassination attempt disguised as senile negligence. Or worse, it was a deliberate trigger. They wanted me to wake up choking on fumes. They wanted me to experience the exact same terror my wife felt in her final moments. They wanted to break my mind, to force me into a state of hysterical panic so they could point at me the next morning and tell Rachel that her father was a dangerous, confused old man who was trying to blow up the house. Once the air was clear, I locked the doors and retreated to the secure confines of my study. I opened my encrypted laptop and accessed the cloud server, pulling up the footage from the kitchen microcamera. The timestamp read 1 a.m. I watched the black and white infrared footage play out in absolute silence. Beatrice walked into the kitchen wearing her silk robe. She did not go to the refrigerator for a glass of water. She walked purposefully to the stove. I watched her hand reach out, pressing and turning the first knob. She paused, waiting for the distinct hiss of the gas. Then she systematically turned the other 4. She did not stumble. She was not sleepwalking. She stood there for a full 10 seconds, taking a deep, satisfied breath of the escaping fumes, before turning around and walking casually back to the master suite. The sheer, unadulterated malice of her actions was almost difficult to comprehend. She was entirely willing to risk destroying the entire house and everyone in it just to manufacture a psychological breaking point for me. I closed the laptop. I did not march down the hall and kick her door down. I did not call the local police to report an attempted arson. The authorities would look at an elderly woman claiming she simply made a mistake while trying to make late-night tea. It would be dismissed as a family dispute, and Trent would use the police report as documented proof of a chaotic, unsafe household. No, you do not argue with an enemy who uses your trauma as a weapon. You simply disarm them completely. The sun rose over the lake, painting the water in brilliant shades of orange and gold. I walked into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, dressed and ready for the day. Beatrice and Gideon were sitting at the breakfast bar, drinking coffee. Beatrice watched me closely, a flicker of profound disappointment crossing her face when she saw me perfectly calm and unharmed. She had clearly expected to wake up to sirens or a hysterical broken old man. I offered them a polite, meaningless smile and poured myself a cup of coffee. I listened to Trent announce that he was taking his parents into the city for the entire day to look at investment properties, maintaining his ridiculous charade of immense wealth. I wished them a wonderful trip and watched their leased vehicle pull out of the driveway. The moment they were gone, my logistical expertise took over. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a commercial appliance distributor I knew from my corporate shipping days. I ordered the most expensive state-of-the-art magnetic induction cooktop they had in their warehouse. I paid a premium for immediate expedited delivery and installation. The second call was to a licensed plumber. By noon, the delivery truck was backing into my driveway. The plumber worked efficiently, capping off the main gas line to the kitchen entirely. We removed the heavy gas range, the very weapon Beatrice had tried to use against me, and hauled it out to the garage. The installation team quickly fitted the sleek, smooth glass surface of the induction cooktop into the marble counter. It required specialized magnetic cookware to operate. It produced absolutely no open flame. It emitted absolutely zero gas. The physical threat was completely and permanently eradicated from my home. I wiped down the new glass surface, feeling a deep clinical satisfaction. Beatrice would return to find her ammunition entirely vanished. She would try to turn the knobs to poison my air again, and she would find nothing but a cold, unresponsive sheet of black glass. I was not just protecting my life. I was sending a silent, undeniable message that her warfare was completely useless against me. With the house secure, I needed to run a quick errand to the local hardware store to purchase new magnetic pots and pans for the induction surface. I was gone for exactly 45 minutes. When I drove back up the gravel driveway, I noticed Gideon's rental car parked near the garage. They had returned earlier than expected. I grabbed the shopping bags from the trunk and walked up the steps to the front porch. I pulled my house key from my pocket and slid the familiar brass metal into the deadbolt. The key slid in, but it absolutely refused to turn. I pulled it out and tried again, assuming the old mechanism was simply sticking. It would not budge. The internal pins of the cylinder did not align. I looked closer at the metal housing of the lock. It was shiny and completely brand new. The slight scratches from years of use were gone. Through the decorative glass panes of the front door, a shadow moved. Gideon stepped into the foyer. He stood on the other side of the glass, looking out at me standing on my own porch with my shopping bags. He raised his hand, holding up a shiny new silver key, and gave me a slow, mocking smile. He had realized that his wife's psychological attack had completely failed, and they had returned to find the gas stove missing. Furious at being outsmarted in my own home, Gideon had retaliated with the blunt force of an arrogant parasite. He had called a locksmith while I was at the store and completely changed the locks on my front door. I stood outside in the afternoon sun, looking at the man who was attempting to physically lock me out of the house I had built with my dead wife. The silent game of chess had just escalated into a physical siege. I stood on the cedar porch of my own home looking through the decorative glass at the man who had just locked me out. Gideon stood in my foyer holding a shiny new silver key. His face was stretched into a smug, victorious grin. He expected a dramatic reaction. He wanted me to pound my fists against the heavy oak door. He wanted me to shout to demand entry to create a chaotic scene that his son Trent could later document as another episode of elderly aggression. I did not give him the satisfaction. I simply looked at him, my expression entirely blank, and slowly lowered my shopping bags to the porch floor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. Gideon frowned, likely assuming I was calling the local police. I was not calling anyone. When Diane and I built this sanctuary, I insisted on integrating a hardwired encrypted smart home system into the property framework. The front door deadbolt was purely mechanical, but the massive insulated garage doors were tethered to a private server I controlled entirely. I opened the application, bypassed the security prompt with my biometric fingerprint, and tapped a single digital button. A deep mechanical rumble vibrated through the foundation of the house. Gideon's smug smile vanished instantly as the heavy garage door slowly began to rise. I picked up my shopping bags, stepped off the porch, and walked down the driveway into the open garage. I bypassed Trent's leased luxury vehicle and stepped through the interior mudroom door, walking straight into my kitchen. Gideon was standing in the hallway, his face flushed with a mixture of intense embarrassment and rising anger. Before he could formulate a coherent sentence, Trent marched out of the living room, smoothing the front of his expensive designer shirt. He immediately stepped in front of his father, adopting that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone he used whenever he was preparing to lie directly to my face. Warren, Trent said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, "Do not be alarmed at all. I know a new key might be a little confusing, but we had to change the locks this afternoon. It was strictly for your own security." I set my shopping bags on the marble island, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. "Security," I repeated quietly, letting the word hang in the air between us. "Yes," Trent sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Rachel and I have been talking. You have been leaving the front door unlocked at night. Mom noticed it yesterday. With your memory slipping, we just could not risk someone wandering in and hurting you. We upgraded to a high-security cylinder. I gave Dad the spare so he can help manage access." I looked at Trent, analyzing his entire posture. He was effortlessly spinning a narrative where my supposed cognitive decline necessitated his hostile takeover of my property access. He was building a documented history of my incompetence, brick by invisible brick, trying to establish a record of a man who could no longer be trusted to lock his own front door. I did not challenge his lie. I simply nodded, looking down at the floor, as if I were a confused, defeated old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. "I see," I murmured softly. "I suppose that is very thoughtful of you, Trent." I took my new magnetic cookware and walked slowly upstairs to the small guest room, playing the role of the docile victim to absolute perfection. The moment the bedroom door clicked shut, the fragile, confused old man vanished entirely. I opened my encrypted laptop and pulled up the audio feed from the living room smoke detector camera. Trent and Gideon were standing by the stone fireplace, their voices hushed, but captured with absolute clarity by the high-definition microphone I had installed. "You cannot just do things like that without telling me first." Trent hissed at his father, pacing nervously across the rug. If he had called the local police to report a lockout, they would have demanded to see the lease agreement. "We do not have a lease, Dad." Gideon scoffed loudly, waving his hand in the air. The old fool did not call anyone. He just stood there looking stupid. Besides, the locksmith gave me the receipt printed in my own name. I used that receipt to update my mailing address at the local post office this afternoon. Trent let out a long, slow breath of relief. "Good. That is exactly what we need. As long as we have utility receipts, mail delivery, and physical keys in our names, we establish primary residency. If he completely loses his mind and tries to kick us out before the bank loan funds, the police cannot physically remove us. They will call it a civil dispute. He will have to file a formal eviction notice. That takes 90 days in this county. 90 days is all I need for the home equity line of credit to clear the final underwriting process. Once that money hits the offshore account, we are gone and the bank can have this rotting house. The sheer calculated brilliance of their legal maneuvering was staggering. They were not just occupying space and eating my food. They were actively weaponizing local tenancy laws to build a fortress around their theft. By establishing themselves as primary residents, they had essentially taken me hostage in my own home using bureaucratic red tape as their shield. They knew the legal eviction process was slow and tedious, giving them the exact window of time required to drain the equity from my property. I closed the laptop, my mind rapidly calculating the logistical countermeasures required to dismantle a sophisticated squatter strategy. But my strategic planning was violently interrupted the very next morning. I was sitting on the back deck, drinking my black coffee, when a sharp, aggressive knock echoed from the front door. I walked through the house and opened it to find a woman in a crisp beige suit standing on my porch. She held a thick clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. I recognized her immediately. It was Patricia, the president of the local homeowners association, and a woman who wielded neighborhood bylaws like a blunt instrument. "Warren," she said sharply, skipping any polite morning greetings. "We have a massive problem. I need to know exactly what kind of illegal commercial operation is being run out of your private dock." I looked at her, maintaining a calm exterior, while my internal alarms blared loudly. "Commercial operation?" I asked evenly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Patricia pulled a printed stack of papers from her clipboard and shoved them toward my chest. "Your house guest, the loud man who drives the rented sedan, has listed your deeded boat dock on a public vacation rental application. He has been charging tourists $200 a day to park their jet skis and pontoon boats on our private community water. We had 3 different groups of intoxicated tourists trespassing through the neighborhood security gates last night, claiming they paid a man named Gideon for very important person lake access. You are in direct violation of 6 different neighborhood ordinances, Warren. You are facing thousands of dollars in daily fines, and the board is drafting a lawsuit for commercial liability as we speak." I looked down at the printed screenshots in my hand. Gideon was not just trying to steal my house. The parasite was actively renting out pieces of it for quick cash, exposing me to catastrophic legal liability. I watched Patricia from the Homeowners Association march back to her vehicle, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. The threat of thousands of dollars in daily fines hung heavily in the air, but I felt absolutely no panic. In the world of supply chain logistics, when a rogue vendor compromises your network, you do not negotiate with them. You simply cut their access to the supply line. Gideon was illegally renting out my private dock and my personal watercraft to intoxicated tourists to line his own empty pockets. He was leveraging my assets to fund his unauthorized occupation of my home. The solution was remarkably simple. I waited until I was entirely certain that Gideon was occupied in the master bathroom upstairs, and then I walked down the gentle slope of the backyard toward the water. The lake was perfectly calm, reflecting the bright morning sun like a sheet of polished glass. I stepped onto the wooden planks of my private dock, feeling the familiar gentle sway of the structure over the water. My boat was tied securely to the cleats. It was a beautiful, meticulously maintained vessel that Diane and I had purchased to spend our retirement exploring the hidden coves of the lake. I did not feel any anger as I stepped aboard and lifted the heavy fiberglass cowling of the outboard motor. Machines are inherently honest. If you remove a critical component, they simply cease to function. There is no negotiation, no gaslighting, no emotional manipulation. I reached into the engine block with a specialized wrench I had slipped into my pocket and carefully extracted all 6 spark plugs. I wiped away a small smudge of grease, wrapped the small metal components in a shop towel, and placed them securely in my jacket. The engine looked entirely untouched from the outside, but it was now nothing more than a heavy, useless piece of metal attached to a floating piece of fiberglass. I lowered the cowling, wiped my hands clean, and walked back up the hill. I poured myself a tall glass of iced tea and sat in a shaded chair on the upper deck, waiting for the inevitable disaster to unfold. The disruption arrived exactly 45 minutes later. A loud, oversized truck parked haphazardly at the end of my driveway, partially blocking the neighborhood street. 4 young men piled out carrying heavy coolers, portable speakers, blasting loud music, and an impressive amount of cheap beer. They were exactly the type of aggressive, reckless tourists the Homeowners Association despised. I watched from my elevated vantage point as Gideon hurried out of the house to greet them. He was wearing a ridiculous nautical-themed shirt, puffing his chest out and gesturing broadly toward the lake as if he were a wealthy marina owner welcoming his esteemed clients. He led the loud group down the grassy slope to the private dock, pointing proudly at my boat. From the deck, I could hear the entire exchange perfectly. Gideon was bragging about the horsepower of the engine and collecting a thick stack of cash from the tallest man in the group before handing over the keys. The young men tossed their heavy coolers onto the pristine upholstery of my vessel, laughing and shouting over their blaring music. The tallest tourist slid into the captain's chair, turned the key in the ignition, and engaged the throttle. The outboard motor let out a pathetic mechanical whine. It sputtered, coughed, and immediately died. The tourist tried again, pumping the throttle aggressively. The starter motor clicked uselessly against the dead engine block. The cheerful atmosphere on the dock vanished in an instant, entirely replaced by aggressive frustration. "Hey, old man," the tourist shouted, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "What kind of garbage are you renting us? This thing will not even turn over." Gideon looked completely panicked. He scrambled onto the boat, reaching for the keys and attempting to start the engine himself. He muttered desperate excuses about flooded lines and cold starts, but the engine remained completely silent. The tourists quickly lost their patience. They had paid premium cash for a luxury lake experience, and they were currently sitting on a broken boat in the blistering sun. The tallest man stepped out of the captain's chair, grabbed Gideon by the collar of his nautical shirt, and physically lifted him off the deck of the boat. He demanded his money back immediately, adding a series of colorful threats about what he would do to Gideon's property if he refused. Gideon was absolutely terrified. His entire facade of wealth and authority crumbled instantly. He fumbled in his pockets, his hands shaking violently, and handed the thick stack of cash back to the aggressive young man. The tourists grabbed their coolers, hurled a few more insults at Gideon's humiliated face, and marched back up the hill, leaving him standing alone on the dock. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. Then he slowly turned around and looked up at the house. He saw me sitting on the upper deck, calmly sipping my iced tea and watching his absolute public humiliation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He knew instantly that I had sabotaged the boat. The fear on his face rapidly mutated into a blind, explosive rage. He stormed up the grassy hill, moving faster than a man with supposedly bad knees ever could. He threw open the sliding glass door and marched directly into the living room where I had just walked in to set down my empty glass. "You did that on purpose, you miserable old fool," Gideon screamed, his face contorted with unadulterated fury. "You deliberately broke the engine to embarrass me in front of my clients." I stood perfectly still, maintaining my calm, analytical posture. "They are not your clients, Gideon," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "And this is not your marina. You are illegally running a commercial enterprise on my property and exposing me to massive liability. The boat will remain inoperable as long as you are residing under my roof." My complete lack of intimidation shattered his final shred of self-control. Gideon lunged across the living room carpet and shoved me with both hands. He hit me hard in the chest, forcing me backward. I stumbled against the heavy oak console table, knocking a decorative lamp to the floor with a loud shattering crash. A sharp pain shot up my shoulder, but I did not retaliate. The physical assault was the exact, undeniable escalation I needed to completely destroy him. But before Gideon could take another aggressive step, the front door burst open. Rachel stood in the foyer, dropping her purse onto the hardwood floor. Her eyes were wide with absolute horror as she stared at the shattered lamp and my bruised shoulder. She had walked in exactly as Gideon violently shoved her 68-year-old father against the furniture. "Dad," she screamed, running toward me and placing herself defensively between me and Gideon. "What is happening here? Why is he attacking you?" Gideon backed away, his arrogant fury instantly transforming into cowardly panic as he realized he had just committed elder abuse in front of a crucial witness. He stammered, trying to formulate a lie about me falling, but Rachel was not listening to him. She turned to me, her face pale and covered in exhausted tears. Her hands were trembling so violently she could barely hold them steady. "I cannot do this anymore, Dad," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a profound, desperate grief. "I cannot live in this constant chaos. I am pregnant. I just found out this morning from the doctor, and I cannot bring a child into a family that behaves like this." The announcement hit me with the force of a freight train. My daughter was pregnant. I was going to be a grandfather. In any normal family, this would be a moment of immense joyous celebration. But we were not a normal family. We were hostages in a war zone. Before I could even wrap my arms around my crying daughter, Trent walked calmly through the front door, having followed her from the driveway. He surveyed the scene with cold, calculating eyes. He saw the shattered lamp, he saw Gideon looking guilty, and he saw his wife weeping in my arms after announcing her pregnancy. A lesser man would have apologized. Trent simply saw a brand new angle of leverage. He stepped into the living room, his posture relaxed but completely predatory. He ignored his father and focused his dead, empty eyes entirely on me. "This is exactly what I have been talking about," Warren Trent said smoothly, completely ignoring the fact that his own father had just assaulted me. "Your cognitive decline is causing a massive violent disruption in our lives. You are breaking things and provoking physical altercations, and now Rachel is pregnant. We cannot possibly raise a vulnerable newborn baby in a house owned by a man who is clearly losing his grip on reality and becoming a physical danger to himself and others." I stared at him, feeling a glacial chill settle deep in my bones. He was actually spinning an unprovoked physical assault into a weapon against my mental competency. "We need to secure the future of this baby," Trent continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing volume. "We need a completely stable, permanent environment. I have drawn up the paperwork to transfer the deed of this lake house into a family trust controlled entirely by me. It is the only way to guarantee that this property remains safe for your future grandchild. If you refuse to sign the house over to the trust, Warren, we will have absolutely no choice but to completely cut you out of this child's life for its own safety. You will never meet your grandchild." The ultimatum was delivered with flawless sociopathic precision. Trent was literally holding my unborn grandchild hostage, demanding the deed to my $1 million home as the ransom payment. He implicitly threatened to erase me from the future of my own bloodline if I refused to surrender my assets to his control. He thought he had played the ultimate trump card. He believed that the emotional weight of a grandchild would instantly break my resolve and force me to submit to his extortion. He was looking at me, waiting for the surrender, expecting the broken old man to finally collapse under the psychological pressure. I looked at Trent. I looked at my weeping daughter, and I made the final silent decision of this war. The observation phase was completely finished. The total and absolute destruction of Trent's entire world was going to commence the very next morning. I looked at Trent standing in the center of my living room, using my unborn grandchild as a bargaining chip. The sheer sociopathic nature of his ultimatum required a masterful performance on my part. I let my shoulders sag forward. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly. I looked down at the hardwood floor, completely avoiding his arrogant gaze. I played the role of a defeated, exhausted old man whose spirit had finally been broken by the relentless pressure of a younger, stronger adversary. "You win, Trent," I whispered, my voice sounding frail and entirely submissive. "If signing the house over to your trust is the only way you will allow me to be part of this child's life, then I will do it. Just let me look over the paperwork tonight so I can understand the terms." Trent smiled, a cold, victorious smile that did not reach his dead eyes. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, stapled stack of legal documents, tossing them carelessly onto the coffee table. "Take your time, Warren," he said smoothly. "Just make sure it is signed and notarized by tomorrow afternoon. We need to secure the future for Rachel and the baby." Rachel looked at me with profound sorrow, but she was too exhausted to fight him anymore. I picked up the heavy stack of papers, holding them, like a man carrying his own death warrant. I walked slowly up the stairs to the guest room, maintaining my broken posture until the door clicked shut. They celebrated quietly downstairs, convinced the war was over. They had no idea they had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed. The next morning, I left the house before the sun had fully risen over the calm water of the lake. I carried Trent's legal documents in a simple manila envelope. I drove straight into the city, parking in the underground garage of my lawyer Stuart's high-rise building. Stuart was already waiting for me in his office, holding a cup of black coffee. I dropped the envelope onto his large mahogany desk. "Read it," I told him, sitting in the leather chair opposite him. Stuart put on his reading glasses and flipped through the pages. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the sound of the paper turning. After 2 minutes, Stuart let out a dry, humorless laugh. "This is not a family trust, Warren," he said, tapping the paper with his expensive pen. "This is a complete transfer of assets. He has written it so that he is the sole managing trustee, and your daughter Rachel is completely excluded from any financial control or legal oversight. If you sign this, you give him the legal right to liquidate the property tomorrow and keep every single penny for himself. It is a predatory trap designed to strip you of your wealth entirely." I nodded, maintaining my calm, analytical posture. "I know Stuart. I read it last night. He is trying to steal the equity to pay off his massive gambling debts." "What do we do with it?" Stuart asked, looking at me intently. I pointed to the heavy industrial shredder sitting in the corner of his office. "We destroy it," I replied. Stuart stood up, fed the thick stack of fraudulent documents into the machine, and we watched as Trent's entire master plan was reduced to useless strips of confetti. "Now we execute the real transfer," I told Stuart, leaning forward. "I need you to completely remove my name from the property deed today." Stuart smiled, pulling a fresh stack of perfectly drafted legal documents from his drawer. We had discussed this exact contingency plan months ago when I first suspected Trent was a massive financial liability. We established an irrevocable blind corporate trust under the name of a faceless limited liability company registered in a different state. By signing these new documents, I was legally transferring the ownership of my $1 million lake house entirely to the corporation. I would no longer be the legal owner of the property. I would simply be a tenant, residing in a house owned by a corporate entity that I secretly controlled from the shadows. The beauty of the blind trust is its absolute logistical efficiency. It is a perfect shield against predators. If Trent tried to execute his forged home equity line of credit, the bank would run a title search and discover that Warren no longer owned the collateral. The loan would automatically fail. If Gideon tried to claim squatters' rights, he would not be fighting an elderly man. He would be fighting a faceless corporation with infinite legal resources. The trap was utterly flawless. I signed the heavy parchment paper with a steady, unwavering hand. Stuart stamped the documents with his official notary seal, rendering the transfer completely legally binding. The house was no longer mine. It was a weaponized fortress, and the parasites currently occupying it were now legally classified as trespassers on corporate property. I drove back to the lake house feeling a profound sense of operational superiority. I expected to find Trent eagerly waiting by the front door, demanding his signed paperwork. Instead, as I turned my vehicle down the long gravel driveway, I was greeted by a wall of deafening noise. The heavy thumping bass of popular music echoed across the water, disturbing the peaceful environment my late wife had loved so much. Dozens of expensive cars were parked haphazardly across my manicured front lawn, destroying the grass and crushing the sprinkler heads. I parked my car near the garage and walked toward the backyard. The sight was absolutely staggering. The sheer audacity of hosting a party while demanding I surrender my home was a perfect display of his narcissistic delusion. Trent had invited at least 50 of his loud, obnoxious friends over for a massive afternoon celebration. They were drinking expensive imported beer, eating barbecue, and tracking mud all over the wooden deck that the contractors had partially destroyed yesterday. Gideon was standing by the grill, acting like the wealthy patriarch of the estate, flipping burgers and handing out drinks. Beatrice was holding court on the patio furniture, laughing loudly, with women I had never met, pouring wine and pointing at my landscaping as if she had designed it herself. I walked quietly onto the deck, remaining entirely unnoticed in the sea of loud, entitled guests. Trent was standing near the edge of the water, holding a plastic cup and shouting over the loud music to a group of his professional peers. "Welcome to my new lake house, gentlemen," Trent yelled, his voice dripping with pure, unfiltered arrogance. "We are doing a full renovation next month. We finally convinced the old man to sign the deed over to us today. He is moving into a nice, quiet retirement home by the end of the week. It took some convincing, but we got it done." His friends cheered loudly, clinking their glasses together in a toast to his supposedly brilliant real estate acquisition. He was publicly humiliating me, declaring me unfit, and claiming my life's work as his own personal trophy. He was celebrating a victory he had not actually won. He thought he was the master of the board, proudly displaying his stolen crown to his entire social circle. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing on property owned by a ruthless corporate entity that was about to completely eradicate his entire existence. I did not interrupt his toast. I did not yell or demand they leave my property. I simply walked into the kitchen, poured myself a tall glass of iced water, and waited for the inevitable consequences of his arrogance to arrive. The final execution phase was about to begin, and I had the best seat in the house. I remained in the kitchen watching the absolute chaos unfold through the large glass windows. The sheer volume of the music was vibrating the crystal glasses in my cabinets. Dozens of entitled people were trampling the pristine grass, dropping empty bottles onto the garden beds, and laughing with the obnoxious volume of those who believe they are untouchable. Trent was holding court on the deck, gesturing wildly with a plastic cup, spilling imported beer onto the cedar planks. He was putting on a magnificent performance for his corporate friends, projecting the image of a young, highly successful real estate mogul. He had absolutely no idea that his entire social empire was built on a foundation of stolen sand. In the world of supply chain logistics, there is a fundamental rule. You never have to manually dismantle a system that is already designed to overload and destroy itself. You simply sit back and let the structural failures occur naturally. I poured myself a glass of iced tea, added 2 cubes of ice, and leaned against the marble counter. I did not need to pick up my phone to call the local authorities. I already knew that Patricia, the aggressive president of our homeowners association, lived exactly 3 houses down the street. She treated local noise ordinances like sacred religious texts. The loud thumping bass of Trent's party was an open declaration of war against her neighborhood. I took a slow sip of my tea and waited for the inevitable response. The response arrived exactly 22 minutes later. The rhythmic flashing of blue and red lights reflected off the dark surface of the lake, painting the trees in urgent, frantic colors. 2 local police cruisers pulled silently onto the edge of my driveway, blocking the exit. The officers did not activate their sirens, but their presence was an immediate cold bucket of water thrown over the arrogant celebration. The loud music was abruptly silenced, leaving only the awkward murmurs of 50 intoxicated guests, realizing they were suddenly involved in a police intervention. Trent shoved his way through the crowd on the deck, spilling his drink in his haste. He marched down the grassy slope to meet the officers, puffing his chest out and attempting to project overwhelming authority. He believed that his expensive clothing and arrogant demeanor would automatically intimidate the local police. I walked quietly out onto the back patio, standing in the shadows of the awning, holding my glass of iced tea. I wanted to hear every single word of his impending humiliation. "Is there a problem, officers?" Trent demanded loudly, ensuring his audience of corporate friends could hear him taking charge. "We are having a private celebration on my property, and we are well within our rights." The lead officer, a tall, seasoned man who looked entirely unimpressed by Trent's performance, simply pulled out a small notepad. "Sir, we received multiple complaints from the Homeowners Association regarding an illegal gathering, excessive noise, and multiple vehicles parked illegally on the grass. I need to see your identification and proof of residency." Trent scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I do not need to show you anything. I am the legal homeowner. My father-in-law just transferred the deed to my trust today. You are harassing a taxpayer on his own private estate, and I want your badge numbers immediately." I took another sip of my iced tea, savoring the absolute perfection of his arrogant lies. He was digging his own grave with a silver spoon. The officer did not flinch. He calmly unclipped his radio and read the license plate number of the massive luxury sports utility vehicle parked directly on my crushed hydrangea bushes. It was Trent's prized possession, the ultimate symbol of his fake wealth. While the officer waited for the dispatch response, Trent continued his aggressive verbal assault. He threatened to call the mayor. He threatened to have the officers fired. He told them they were ruining a highly exclusive networking event. His friends watched from the deck, whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with his erratic and hostile behavior. The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled with a sudden burst of static. The dispatcher's voice echoed across the quiet lawn, delivering a message that was louder and more destructive than any party music. "The vehicle is flagged," the dispatcher announced clearly. "We have an active repossession order from the primary lender for 6 months of severely delinquent payments. The bank has requested immediate impound." The silence that fell over the backyard was absolute. The arrogant smirk vanished from Trent's face, entirely replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. His wealthy corporate friends, the people he had spent thousands of stolen dollars trying to impress, stared at him in complete shock. The successful mogul who had just bragged about acquiring $1 million lake house could not even afford to make the lease payments on his own vehicle. The heavy rumble of a diesel engine broke the quiet tension. A large industrial tow truck backed slowly down the neighborhood street, its amber lights flashing rhythmically. The bank had clearly been tracking the vehicle through its internal global positioning system, waiting for the perfect moment to execute the recovery. Trent lunged forward, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot take my car. There is a mistake with the bank. I have the money. I just secured a massive equity line of credit today." The officer stepped smoothly in front of the vehicle, placing a firm hand on Trent's chest. "Sir, step back immediately. The bank owns this vehicle, and you are currently interfering with a legal repossession. If you touch this truck, you will be arrested for obstruction." Trent stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, watching helplessly as the tow truck operator quickly attached thick metal chains to the axles of his luxury vehicle. The symbol of his fake empire was being dragged away in front of his entire social circle. The humiliation was total and absolute. The guests began to leave immediately, walking briskly down the driveway, with their heads lowered, desperate to distance themselves from the embarrassing spectacle. Gideon and Beatrice hid inside the house, entirely unwilling to face the public shame of their son's financial collapse. Trent was left standing alone on the ruined grass, watching his car disappear down the street. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He slowly turned around, his eyes scanning the empty deck, until they locked onto me, standing in the shadows with my glass of iced tea. His shame instantly mutated into a violent, explosive rage. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to blame for his own pathetic failures. He marched toward this patio, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You did this," Trent screamed, his voice echoing across the water. "You called the police. You set me up to embarrass me in front of my investors. You are a sick, demented old man, and I am going to make sure you are locked in a padded room for the rest of your miserable life." I did not blink. I did not step back. I simply looked at the broken, pathetic parasite standing before me. He was completely out of options, out of money, and out of time. His public execution was flawless, but his desperate threat confirmed my next necessary step. He was going to try to force a medical ambush to access the house equity he so desperately needed. I welcomed the attempt. I was fully prepared to watch him walk directly into the final trap. The morning after the disastrous backyard gathering brought a suffocating tension to the lake house. The sprawling green lawn was still torn up from the tow truck tires, and the silence inside the walls was heavy with the weight of Trent's absolute humiliation. He had lost his luxury vehicle, his social standing, and his illusion of control all in the span of a single afternoon. I knew exactly what a desperate man looked like when his back was against the wall. A cornered parasite does not retreat gracefully. It thrashes wildly, looking for any possible method to survive. Trent was completely out of time and out of options. His hidden debts were closing in on him, and he needed the massive payout from that forged home equity line of credit immediately. To get that money, he needed the bank to accept his fraudulent power of attorney. And to validate that power of attorney, he desperately needed a medical professional to declare me legally incompetent. I did not challenge the absurd lie. I knew exactly why this man was standing in my living room. Trent had scoured the absolute bottom of the medical barrel to find a physician desperate or corrupt enough to perform a targeted ambush. I stood up slowly, offering the man a polite and perfectly steady handshake. I invited Dr. Aris to take a seat on the leather sofa, while Trent paced relentlessly back and forth near the kitchen island. The doctor opened his briefcase, pulled out a generic medical clipboard, and retrieved a cheap plastic pen. He did not check my blood pressure or look into my eyes with a medical light. He went straight for the cognitive evaluation, attempting to establish a documented baseline for my supposed dementia. He started with the most basic, insulting questions designed to trip up a failing mind. Warren, the doctor, began speaking to me slowly and loudly, as if I were already a patient in a locked memory care ward. "Can you tell me what the current year is? Can you tell me who the president is? Do you know what city you are currently residing in?" I sat perfectly straight in my armchair, resting my hands calmly on my knees. I looked directly into the doctor's shifting, nervous eyes. I did not just answer his questions. I dismantled his entire evaluation with razor-sharp, flawless precision. "I am fully aware that it is a Tuesday morning in October," I replied, my voice echoing with quiet authority. "I am residing in my private home on the shores of Lake Lanier in the state of Georgia. The current temperature outside is exactly 72 degrees. The closing price of the Dow Jones Industrial Average yesterday was 34,211 points. If you would like, I can also recite the complex algorithmic formulas I used to route international shipping freighters through the Panama Canal during my 40-year career as a supply chain logistics director." The doctor swallowed hard, the cheap plastic pen trembling slightly in his hand. Trent stopped pacing and stared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. The doctor tried again, attempting to push me into a corner with a memory test. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I executed the mathematical sequence instantly, without a single pause or hesitation, firing the numbers back at him like a machine gun. I then proceeded to ask the doctor about the specific pharmacology of early-onset memory loss medications, casually demonstrating a medical vocabulary that completely dwarfed his own. I spoke about neuroplasticity and the legal thresholds for cognitive impairment in this specific county, making it abundantly clear that I knew exactly what the legal parameters of this interview were. I gave him absolutely nothing. I was the sharpest and most composed person in the entire house. Dr. Aris slowly lowered his clipboard. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He looked over at Trent with an expression of profound defeat. He realized immediately that he was sitting across from a man whose mental faculties were completely uncompromised. Any medical professional who dared to sign a legal declaration stating I was incompetent would be risking their medical license and inviting a massive medical malpractice lawsuit. The doctor closed his briefcase with a loud, definitive snap. "Trent," the doctor muttered, standing up from the sofa. "I think we need to speak privately for a moment. This situation is not exactly what you described to me on the phone." Trent's face drained of all remaining color. He nodded frantically, gesturing toward the closed door of my private home office. They walked quickly down the hallway, stepping into the study and shutting the heavy oak door tightly behind them. They assumed they had secured a private, unobserved space to negotiate their failure. They were completely wrong. I did not follow them down the hallway. I did not try to press my ear against the wood to listen. I simply stood up, walked calmly up the stairs, and entered my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my mattress, retrieved my encrypted smartphone from my pocket, and opened the secure cloud surveillance application. I tapped on the live video feed broadcasting directly from the micro camera hidden flawlessly inside the smoke detector of the study. The digital connection established, instantly delivering a pristine high-definition image to my screen. The audio feed picked up their frantic whispers with absolute clarity. Trent was standing near my mahogany desk, grabbing the doctor by the lapels of his cheap suit. "You promised me you would sign the paperwork," Trent hissed desperately. "You told me you would sign the declaration of incompetence today." The doctor pushed Trent's hands away, shaking his head violently. "I cannot sign that document." "Trent," the doctor shot back, his voice laced with fear. "Your father-in-law is completely lucid. He is sharper than I am. If I sign a legal medical affidavit claiming that man has dementia, I will be investigated by the state medical board before the end of the week. It is too much of a risk. I am leaving." Trent lunged forward, physically blocking the door. He was a drowning man, gasping for his final breath. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, bulging manila envelope. He shoved it violently against the doctor's chest. "There is $10,000 in untraceable cash right there," Trent pleaded, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. "Just sign the damn paper right now. You take the money, you walk out that door, and you never have to see us again. I need that signature today, or I am going to lose absolutely everything." I watched through the glowing screen of my phone as the doctor looked down at the thick envelope of cash. He hesitated for 3 long, agonizing seconds, weighing the heavy risk of losing his medical license against the immediate reward of $10,000. The greed overpowered his fear. The doctor let out a long breath, snatched the envelope from Trent's hands, and shoved it deep into his briefcase. He pulled the blank declaration of incompetence from his clipboard, laid it flat on my mahogany desk, and signed his name on the bottom line using his cheap plastic pen. He handed the forged medical document to my son-in-law, sealing their dark, fraudulent pact. I smiled quietly in the solitude of my bedroom, turning off my phone screen. Trent thought he had successfully purchased his golden ticket to steal my home equity. He did not realize that the federal crime of medical bribery and document fraud had just been permanently recorded and uploaded to a secure cloud server in brilliant 4,000 pixel resolution. The medical ambush had completely failed, and the final pieces of their criminal prosecution were now safely locked away in my digital vault. The afternoon sun hung low over the lake, casting long shadows across the torn-up grass of my front lawn. I sat in my study reviewing the high-definition footage of the medical bribe, feeling a profound sense of absolute control. The digital trap was fully armed, and Trent was completely oblivious to his impending legal destruction. But the world of criminal debt does not operate on bureaucratic schedules. Criminals do not wait for bank underwriting processes to clear. They operate on a strict timeline of immediate intimidation and blunt force. The heavy crunch of gravel outside my window broke the afternoon silence. I stood up and walked to the glass, observing the driveway. It was not Trent returning from his errands. A sleek black sedan with heavily tinted windows rolled slowly toward the house, parking deliberately across the main exit path to block anyone from leaving. 2 massive men stepped out of the vehicle. They were not wearing the cheap, ill-fitting suits of desperate local contractors or fake doctors. They wore meticulously tailored dark clothing that barely concealed their sheer physical bulk. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of men who were entirely accustomed to enacting violence for a living. I recognized the type immediately from my decades overseeing international shipping ports. These were not collection agents from a corporate bank. These were enforcers from a highly organized illegal syndicate. Trent had not just ruined his credit score. He had borrowed a massive amount of money from people who broke bones when they were not repaid. I remained out of sight, observing the scene from the second-floor window. The front door of the house opened before the men even reached the porch. Beatrice stepped out onto the cedar deck, her face pale, but her posture rigid as she attempted to project the false authority of a wealthy matriarch. She raised her hand defensively, standing between the men and the doorway. I opened the window just a crack to let the audio carry up to my position. The lake air was completely still, allowing every word of their exchange to travel upward with terrifying clarity. The taller of the two men stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs, looking up at Beatrice with dead, empty eyes. "We are not here to talk to you," the man said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "We are here for Trent. He missed his final extension payment yesterday. His phone is turned off, and our employer has lost his patience. Bring your son out here right now, or we are going to walk inside and drag him out ourselves." Beatrice began to tremble, her arrogant facade crumbling under the weight of a genuine physical threat. She stepped backward, clutching the collar of her silk blouse. "You cannot come inside," she stammered, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Trent is not here right now, but I swear to you we have the money. We have everything we owe you. We just need a few more days for the wire transfer to clear the final underwriting department." The second man laughed, a dry, humorless sound that chilled the air. "Your son owes a massive amount of money, lady. He has been dodging our calls for 3 weeks, spinning lies about a rich father-in-law and a magic lake house. Our employer does not want excuses anymore. He wants his $150,000 today." Beatrice clasped her hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "I am telling you the absolute truth," she cried out completely, confirming the exact dollar amount of the forged home equity line of credit. "The bank approved the loan yesterday. We have the medical documents signed, and the power of attorney is fully activated. We are pulling $150,000 of equity out of this house. The funds will drop into Trent's account by Friday morning. I will personally guarantee that you get every single penny wire transferred directly to your employer before noon on Friday. Please, you just have to give us 48 more hours." The men exchanged a slow, calculating look. They were seasoned predators, smelling the desperation in her voice and recognizing a genuine financial transaction when they heard one. They knew Beatrice was telling the truth about the incoming loan, but they also knew that fear was the only way to ensure the money actually arrived. The taller man took a step up the wooden stairs, closing the distance between himself and Beatrice. Friday at noon, the man stated his tone utterly devoid of mercy. "If the money is not in the account by Friday at 1 minute past noon, we are coming back, and we will not be knocking on the front door." Before Beatrice could even nod her frantic agreement, the sound of a vehicle turning down the gravel driveway shattered the tense standoff. I looked past the black sedan and felt my entire heart stop dead in my chest. It was Rachel. My beautiful, exhausted, pregnant daughter was pulling her small car into the driveway, entirely unaware that she was driving directly into an active extortion scene. She parked her car near the garage and stepped out carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries. She paused, looking confusedly at the massive black sedan blocking her path, and the 2 intimidating men standing on the porch with Trent's mother. The men turned their attention away from Beatrice and focused entirely on Rachel. The taller man tilted his head, a sick, predatory recognition dawning on his face. He walked slowly down the porch stairs, walking deliberately toward my daughter. Rachel took a cautious step backward, clutching the grocery bags against her stomach. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wavering as the 2 massive men completely cornered her against the side of her car. "You must be Trent's wife," the taller man said, stepping uncomfortably close to her, invading her personal space. Trent talks about you a lot. He says you are a very hard-working woman. It would be an absolute tragedy if something terrible were to happen to such a lovely pregnant lady, just because her husband refused to pay his debts. The man reached out a thick finger and tapped the side of Rachel's car directly next to her trembling hand. "Tell your husband he has until Friday," the man whispered, leaning in close to her face. "If he fails us, we are going to come back and we are going to start collecting our payment by taking the things he loves the most." Rachel let out a small, terrified gasp, her eyes wide with absolute horror as the reality of her husband's criminal life crashed down upon her. The cold, analytical auditor inside me vanished instantly. Every protective paternal instinct I possessed erupted into a blazing, uncontrollable fire. The observation phase of this war was completely over. These parasites had not just tried to steal my money and my home. They had dragged my pregnant daughter into a deadly criminal underworld and placed a target directly on her back. I did not run down the stairs. I descended them with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a collapsing building. I pushed through the front door, brushing past a stunned Beatrice, and walked straight down the driveway. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout threats. I simply walked directly between the two massive enforcers and my terrified daughter, placing my body as an impenetrable shield between them. I looked the taller man directly in his dead, empty eyes. I stood perfectly straight, tapping into 4 decades of commanding international logistics operations. "You have exactly 10 seconds to step away from my daughter," I stated, my voice radiating a freezing, absolute authority that made both men pause. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly who sent you. You are operating outside your designated territory, and you are currently threatening the family of a man who possesses enough digital leverage to dismantle your employer's entire local syndicate by tomorrow morning." The men bristled, ready to intimidate me, but they saw absolutely no fear in my eyes. They saw a man who was perfectly willing to unleash catastrophic consequences upon them. "I am not the man who owes you money." I continued, stepping 1 inch closer to the enforcer, forcing him to take a subconscious step backward. "The man who owes you money is hiding inside that house like a coward. You have delivered your message for Friday. Now you are going to get into your vehicle and you are going to drive off my private property before I dial a federal contact who will gladly impound your vehicle and seize your employer's assets." The taller man assessed my unwavering posture and decided the risk was no longer worth the immediate confrontation. They had secured the promise of payment for Friday, and they did not want to trigger a federal investigation over a driveway intimidation tactic. He gave me a slow, calculating nod, turned around, and signaled to his partner. They climbed back into their sleek black sedan and reversed up the long gravel driveway, disappearing into the fading afternoon light. I turned around and looked at Rachel. The grocery bags had fallen from her hands, spilling fresh fruit across the crushed stone. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around her pregnant stomach, shaking with the profound trauma of the violent encounter. I pulled her into my chest, holding her fiercely as she cried into my shoulder. The illusion of her marriage was completely shattered. She finally saw the terrifying, dangerous reality of the man she had married. I held my daughter, knowing that the time for silent traps and careful documentation was completely finished. Trent and his family had brought physical danger to my doorstep. They had threatened the life of my unborn grandchild. The quiet game of chess was officially over. I looked up at the house where Beatrice was still cowering on the porch. I was no longer just an observer gathering evidence in the shadows. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and the execution phase was about to begin with absolute, merciless precision. The morning after the debt collectors arrived, the atmosphere in the lake house was thick with desperate, frantic energy. Trent was pacing the living room like a caged animal barking into his cell phone. I remained in my study, monitoring the cameras, fully aware that today was the deadline he had promised the syndicate. The bank required one final step before releasing the $150,000 from the home equity line of credit. They needed a physical appraisal of the property to confirm the collateral value. At 10 in the morning, a rusted sedan pulled into my driveway. A man with a cheap suit and a clipboard stepped out. He did not look like a licensed real estate appraiser. He looked exactly like a man Trent had hired from a local bar to rubber stamp a fraudulent valuation. Trent practically sprinted out the front door to greet him, clapping him on the shoulder and leading him inside. I walked out of my study and poured myself a cup of coffee, leaning against the kitchen counter as they began their walkthrough. Trent ignored me entirely, treating me like a piece of invisible furniture. He guided the appraiser through the living room, pointing out the vaulted ceilings and the stone fireplace, aggressively inflating the value of every single fixture. He talked about the panoramic lake views and the wraparound deck, desperately trying to guarantee a valuation that would satisfy the bank's final underwriter. The appraiser barely glanced at the rooms. He scribbled a few meaningless notes on his clipboard, nodding along to Trent's frantic sales pitch. It was a complete farce, a pathetic pantomime designed to satisfy a bureaucratic requirement. I watched them walk through the entire first floor, allowing them to complete their fraudulent inspection without a single interruption. I wanted Trent to feel the absolute high of impending victory. I wanted him to believe that the finish line was just inches away. As they returned to the foyer, the appraiser handed Trent a piece of paper to sign. "Everything looks perfect, Trent," the man said, his voice slick and rehearsed. "I will submit this report to the bank within the hour. You should see the funds released by this afternoon." Trent let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He actually smiled, a genuine, arrogant smirk of absolute victory. "Thank you," he replied, shaking the man's hand vigorously. "You have no idea how much this means to my family's future." The appraiser left, pulling out of the driveway quickly. Trent turned around, his chest puffed out, radiating the smug superiority of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen my entire life's work. He looked at me standing in the kitchen, and his smirk widened into a cruel, condescending sneer. "Well," Warren Trent said, walking slowly toward me, "it is officially done. The appraisal is finished, and the bank is releasing the funds today. I am moving forward with the transfer of the deed into my trust by the end of the week. You can start packing your bags. We found a very nice, very secure facility for you in the next county over." I did not move. I did not flinch. I slowly set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. I reached into the inner pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed logo of my primary bank. I held it out toward him, my expression perfectly blank. "What is this?" Trent asked, his smirk faltering slightly as he stared at the envelope. I did not speak. I simply held it there until he had no choice but to reach out and take it. He tore open the seal, his eyes scanning the certified letter inside. The color drained from his face instantly, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. The letter was a formal, definitive fraud rejection notice. It stated clearly that the bank's internal investigations department had flagged the application for the home equity line of credit. The power of attorney document he had submitted was mathematically and legally impossible to verify. The notary stamp had been identified as invalid, and the entire transaction was now frozen under suspicion of felony wire fraud. The letter concluded by stating that local law enforcement had been notified of the attempted theft. Trent's hands began to shake violently. The paper fluttered in his grip. This is impossible," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "The portal said it was approved. The portal said the money was coming today." "The portal was a digital ghost, Trent," I replied, my voice echoing with freezing, absolute authority. "A mirror designed to keep you occupied while the cage was locked. Did you genuinely believe a man who spent 40 years tracking international corporate fraud would allow an arrogant, financially illiterate child to forge his signature and steal his home? The reality of his situation crashed down upon him like a concrete wall. The money was not coming. The bank knew he was a fraud. The authorities had been alerted, and the violent, dangerous men from the syndicate were expecting a wire transfer by the end of the day. He was completely, irrevocably trapped. The panic in his eyes instantly mutated into a blind, explosive, animalistic rage. He dropped the letter onto the floor. He let out a primal roar of sheer fury and charged directly at me across the kitchen floor. He did not stop to think. He did not consider the consequences. He grabbed me violently by the collar of my cardigan, his fists twisting the fabric tightly against my throat. He shoved me backward, with all of his remaining desperate strength slamming me hard against the drywall of the kitchen. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. A sharp pain radiated through my shoulder, but I did not fight back. I did not raise a hand to defend myself. I looked directly into his wild, furious eyes. "You ruined everything!" Trent screamed, spit flying from his mouth, his face inches from mine. "I am going to lose everything because of you. I should have killed you. I should have thrown you down the stairs the day we moved in." He shook me violently, screaming obscenities and threats entirely consumed by his own destructive rage. He was utterly unaware that directly above my head, perfectly hidden behind the custom kitchen valance, the high-definition micro camera was capturing every single second of the assault. The audio feed recorded his explicit violent threats. The video feed captured his hands gripping my collar, the brutal shove against the wall, the terrifying display of a young, powerful man physically assaulting an elderly victim. He was handing me the final undeniable piece of evidence I required. He had just committed felony elder abuse, battery, and assault, all in brilliant 4,000 pixel resolution. The trap had not just closed, it had snapped shut, breaking every bone in his metaphorical body. The execution phase was now completely authorized, and I had exactly what I needed to obliterate his existence forever. Trent released his grip on my collar the moment he realized physical violence would not magically produce $150,000. He stumbled backward, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the kitchen like a trapped rat looking for an escape route. Without another word, he ran out the front door, peeling his leased rental car out of the driveway to pick up Gideon and Beatrice. They were heading into the city on a frantic, doomed mission to secure a desperate bridge loan from predatory lenders. The house fell entirely silent the moment their engine faded into the distance. The physical pain in my shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, but my mind was completely focused on the final extraction. The parasites were gone for at least 3 hours. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed my daughter's office number. I told her I needed her to come to the lake house immediately. I did not frame it as a request. I used the voice of a father who was commanding his child to step out of the path of a speeding train. Rachel promised she was leaving work right then. She pulled into the driveway 40 minutes later, looking paler and more exhausted than I had ever seen her. The stress of her pregnancy, combined with the toxic chaos of her marriage, was visibly draining the life from her. I met her on the front porch and guided her inside, locking the heavy oak door firmly behind us. I did not offer her a cup of tea. I did not make small talk about the weather or her commute. We did not have time for pleasantries. I walked her directly into my private study, the one room in the house the parasites had not been able to contaminate. I offered her the leather armchair across from my mahogany desk, and I sat down in my own seat, opening my secure laptop. Rachel looked at the bruised skin visible just above the collar of my cardigan, but before she could ask, I held up my hand to stop her. "Rachel, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to remain completely silent until the screen goes dark," I told her, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. "What I am about to show you is going to completely destroy the reality you believe you are living in. It is going to hurt you in ways I cannot prevent. But as your father, it is my absolute duty to show you the truth before the man you married destroys you and your unborn child entirely." Rachel gripped the armrests of the leather chair, her knuckles turning white. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the glowing monitor of my computer. I pressed the playback button on the compiled video file I had meticulously assembled over the past several weeks. The screen illuminated with the black and white infrared footage of my kitchen at 2 a.m. Rachel watched in absolute silence as Beatrice walked over to the range. She saw Trent's mother purposefully and methodically twist all 5 gas knobs into the open position, allowing raw poison to flood the house where I slept. Rachel let out a small, choked gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. She watched Beatrice take a deep, satisfied breath of the toxic fumes and walk away, leaving her own father to suffocate or burn. I paused the video, letting the sheer malicious intent of the act sink into her mind. They were not just rude house guests, Rachel, I stated quietly. They were actively attempting to manufacture a fatal accident to expedite their inheritance. I advanced the footage to the next file, showing the interior of the very study we were currently sitting in. The hidden camera perfectly captured Trent aggressively shoving a thick envelope of cash into the chest of the corrupt medical examiner. Rachel's eyes widened in horror as she listened to the crisp audio. She heard her husband offering $10,000 in untraceable cash to purchase a fraudulent declaration of my absolute mental incompetence. She heard the man she loved, the man she was currently building a family with, refer to me as an obstacle that needed to be permanently removed. The color drained completely from her face as she realized that every single concern Trent had ever expressed about my cognitive decline was a carefully orchestrated predatory lie. He had been gaslighting her for months, preparing her to accept my institutionalization without question. The screen shifted again, displaying the high-resolution photographs of the forged home equity line of credit application. I explained to my daughter exactly how her husband had stolen my social security number, forged my signature, and manipulated a corrupt notary to drain $150,000 of equity out of my home. But the reason for the theft was what finally shattered her remaining defenses. I played the audio of the violent debt collectors cornering Beatrice on the porch. Rachel listened to the terrifying truth about the syndicate enforcers who had threatened her in the driveway just yesterday. Trent did not have a bad investment. He had a massive illegal gambling debt, and he had placed his pregnant wife directly in the crosshairs of ruthless criminals who promised to collect their payment by taking whatever he loved most. I let the final video play without any introduction. It was the footage from the kitchen taken less than 2 hours ago. Rachel watched the screen as her husband flew into a blind, explosive rage upon realizing his fraudulent loan had been blocked by the bank. She watched the man who was supposed to protect her charge across the room and grab her 68-year-old father by the throat. She heard his violent screaming threats. She saw him hurl me backward against the drywall with brutal, unrestrained force. The video ended, leaving the study in a heavy, suffocating silence. Rachel did not scream. She did not throw anything. She simply collapsed internally, folding forward in the leather armchair as deep, agonizing sobs tore through her chest. The illusion of her marriage, her future, and her safety had been completely vaporized in less than 15 minutes. She realized she was sharing a bed with a sociopathic predator who viewed her family as nothing more than a bank to be robbed and disposed of. I walked around the desk and pulled my weeping daughter into my arms. I did not offer her empty platitudes. I did not tell her that everything was going to be all right, because the old life she knew was officially dead. I offered her the only thing that mattered in a crisis: a highly structured extraction plan. "We are leaving right now," I told her, lifting her gently by the shoulders and forcing her to look me in the eyes. Trent and his parents are currently in the city attempting to secure cash from people who will likely break their legs by tomorrow morning. They are desperate, and desperate people are incredibly dangerous. You cannot be anywhere near this property when they return and realize the walls have completely closed in on them. Rachel nodded blindly, her face streaked with tears, wiping her eyes with the back of her trembling hands. I walked her upstairs to the master suite, and we packed 2 large suitcases with all of her essential clothing, important financial documents, and valuable personal items. We moved with the silent, urgent efficiency of soldiers evacuating a collapsing war zone. We loaded her bags into the trunk of my vehicle, completely bypassing her car, which Trent would undoubtedly attempt to track. I drove her away from the lake house, leaving the property completely empty and waiting for the parasites to return. I did not take her to a friend's house or a local apartment. I drove 60 miles outside the city limits to a highly exclusive, secure luxury hotel where I had already paid for a month-long reservation in cash using an assumed corporate name. The facility had gated entry, 24-hour private security, and required key card access for every single floor. Trent would never be able to find her here. I carried her bags up to the penthouse suite, ensuring the room was perfectly secure. Rachel sat on the edge of the pristine king-sized bed, looking out the large windows at the unfamiliar city skyline. She looked broken, but she was finally completely safe. I took her cell phone from her purse, popped the plastic backing off, and removed the internal subscriber identity module card, completely severing her digital connection to Trent. I handed her a brand new encrypted smartphone that I had purchased specifically for this exact moment. "Only you, my lawyer. Stuart and I have this phone number," I instructed her, placing the device in her hand. "Trent can no longer reach you, manipulate you, or threaten you. You are officially untouchable." I stood in the doorway of the luxury suite looking at my daughter, who was now completely protected behind an impenetrable wall of corporate security and financial leverage. The extraction was flawlessly executed. Trent, Gideon, and Beatrice were currently wandering the city searching for a financial miracle that did not exist. Within a few hours, they would return to the lake house exhausted and terrified, only to find Rachel's belongings missing and the house completely silent. They would assume they still had time to formulate a new lie. They had absolutely no idea that the final legal guillotine was already dropping, and they had nowhere left to run. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dramatic shadows across the driveway. I stood on the top step of the cedar porch, the very porch where this invasion had begun, waiting for the final act to unfold. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. Flanking me on my left was Stuart, his silver briefcase gripped firmly in his hand, radiating the cold, calculating aura of a legal executioner. Flanking me on my right were 3 uniformed police officers, their presence a silent, undeniable confirmation that the observation phase of this war was permanently concluded. Lined up precisely at the base of the stairs, sitting on the crushed gravel, were the 4 massive hard-shell suitcases that Trent had so arrogantly unloaded weeks ago. I had packed them myself, meticulously ensuring every single item belonging to the parasites was removed from the interior of the house. I did not want them to have a single reason to cross the threshold again. The crunch of tires announced their arrival. Trent turned his leased replacement vehicle into the driveway, pulling up aggressively and slamming it into park. He stepped out first, his face a mask of absolute frantic desperation. He had clearly spent the entire afternoon failing to secure a bridge loan from anyone willing to answer his calls. Gideon and Beatrice emerged from the passenger doors, looking equally exhausted and terrified by the impending reality of their son's massive syndicate debts. Trent stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the suitcases. He looked up at me, then at Stuart, and finally at the 3 police officers standing in absolute silence. His brain struggled to process the scene oscillating between the arrogant delusion he had maintained for years and the terrifying truth that was currently staring him in the face. "Well, what is this?" Warren Trent demanded, attempting to force a laugh that came out sounding thin and hysterical. "Are you throwing a tantrum because we were gone all day? I demand to see my wife." Rachel. Rachel. "Come out here. Your father is having another episode." He stepped toward the porch, completely ignoring the luggage, assuming his aggressive entitlement would easily part the sea of authority figures. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked down at him with the clinical detachment of a man watching a disease finally succumb to an antibiotic. "Rachel is not here, Trent," I stated, my voice cutting through the crisp autumn air. "And you will never see her or speak to her again. I have extracted her from the fraudulent, predatory lie that you call a marriage." Trent stopped at the base of the stairs, his face flushing a deep, violent red. He pointed a shaking finger at me, turning to the police officers to deploy the legal strategy he had discussed with Gideon weeks ago. "Officers, this man is suffering from severe dementia. He is not legally competent to kick us out. We have established primary residency here. My father updated his mailing address. We have squatters' rights. He cannot evict us without a 90-day court order. This is an illegal lockout. Stewart stepped forward, opening his silver briefcase with a smooth, practiced motion. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the heavy embossed seal of the state. He did not hand them to Trent. He held them up for the officers to see. "Gentlemen," Stewart announced, his voice carrying the full weight of a ruthless legal architect. "My client, Mr. Warren, does not own this property. He is merely a tenant. This lake house is owned entirely by an irrevocable blind corporate trust. The individuals standing in the driveway do not have a lease agreement with the corporation. They are not authorized guests of the corporation. They are currently trespassing on private commercial property, and the corporate entity is demanding their immediate removal." Trent's jaw actually dropped. The arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked from Stewart to me, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The fortress of bureaucratic red tape he thought he had built around himself had just been vaporized by a superior legal maneuver. "You cannot do that," Trent stammered, his voice rising in panic. "That is illegal. I have a power of attorney. I have a medical declaration of incompetence." He reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling frantically to produce the forged documents he had purchased with a $10,000 bribe. One of the officers stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his utility belt. "Mr. Trent," the officer stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy, "we are not here to facilitate a civil eviction. We are here to execute an active felony arrest warrant." The words hung in the air, heavy and definitive. Trent froze, the forged papers slipping from his trembling fingers. Gideon and Beatrice backed away from their son, their eyes wide with terror, as the reality of the situation finally breached their arrogant delusions. The officer pulled a folded document from his vest pocket. "You are under arrest for felony wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud forgery and felony elder abuse. We have reviewed the high-definition surveillance footage from the interior of this residence. We have the complete recording of you attempting to bribe a corrupt medical professional. We have the audio of your violent threats, and we have the video of you physically assaulting this gentleman in his kitchen. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately." Trent's legs gave out. He collapsed onto his knees in the gravel, his hands hovering in the air, as if he were trying to catch the pieces of his shattered life before they hit the ground. He began to sob, a pathetic, desperate sound that echoed across the quiet lake. No, you do not understand. I just need more time. The bank approved the loan. The money is coming. I just need more time." The officers did not hesitate. They moved in swiftly, securing his arms behind his back and snapping the heavy metal handcuffs shut. The sharp clicking sound was the final period at the end of his fraudulent existence. Beatrice, who had been watching her son's destruction in stunned silence, suddenly snapped. The realization that her luxury retirement plan was gone, that her son was going to federal prison, and that the quiet, unassuming man she had tried to poison had completely outsmarted her, triggered a blind, hysterical rage. She let out a guttural scream and lunged toward the porch, her hands outstretched, aiming directly for my face. "You ruined everything!" she shrieked, her face contorted with pure hatred. "You set us up, you miserable old—" She did not finish the sentence. The third officer intercepted her instantly, grabbing her by the arm and spinning her around with practiced efficiency. He forced her face down against the hood of the police cruiser, securing her wrists in a second pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault and battery," the officer announced, ignoring her screaming protests. "And based on the surveillance footage we reviewed this morning regarding the gas stove, you will likely be facing charges for attempted arson and reckless endangerment by the end of the week." Gideon stood completely alone in the driveway, surrounded by the 4 massive suitcases. His son was weeping in the back of a police cruiser. His wife was screaming obscenities as she was shoved into another. His entire family was being hauled away to face decades in the federal penal system. He looked up at me, his face pale and entirely defeated. What am I supposed to do?" Gideon stammered, his voice weak and trembling. I looked down at the man who had tried to steal my home, who had treated me with absolute contempt, and who had actively participated in the plot to destroy my life. I did not offer him pity. I did not offer him advice. "You are going to pick up your bags, Gideon," I told him, my voice echoing with freezing absolute authority. "And you are going to walk off corporate property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Gideon did not argue. He grabbed two of the heavy suitcases struggling under their weight and began the long, humiliating walk down the gravel driveway, leaving his family behind to face the absolute destruction they had built for themselves. The silent trap had perfectly executed its design. The parasites were gone, and the sanctuary was finally secure. 6 months have passed since the flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the crisp autumn night, leaving my driveway completely empty and my property finally secure. Time is a ruthless auditor that balances every ledger eventually, and the final accounts of this conflict have been settled with absolute, merciless precision. Trent is currently residing in a federal penitentiary facility located 200 miles away from the life of fabricated luxury he so desperately tried to maintain. He traded his tailored Italian suits and leased European sports vehicles for a standard-issue orange canvas uniform and a concrete cell measuring exactly 8 feet by 10 feet. There are no corporate networking galas in federal prison. There are no gullible investors to dazzle with empty promises and forged financial portfolios. He has been systematically stripped of his most potent weapon, which was his ability to manipulate the perception of others. The federal judge sentenced him to 12 years for his elaborate orchestration of wire fraud, forgery, and felony elder abuse. But the criminal justice system is actually the least of his immediate concerns. The underground syndicate, the highly dangerous men he owed $150,000 to, did not simply forgive his massive gambling debt because of his sudden incarceration. That illicit debt is currently accumulating a staggering amount of street-level interest. It is waiting patiently for him in the shadows of the outside world. When Trent eventually completes his sentence and walks out of those heavy iron prison gates, a broken middle-aged man, he will step directly into a financial and physical nightmare from which he can never legally escape. He tried to steal my home equity to save himself, but he only succeeded in burying himself alive under a mountain of inescapable violent consequences. He sits in his cell every single night knowing that his own arrogance was the sole architect of his total destruction. Gideon and Beatrice experienced a similar catastrophic fall from grace. When the police cruisers hauled their son away that afternoon, Gideon was left standing alone in my driveway, with nothing but 4 heavy suitcases and the clothes on his back. Without Trent's stolen funds to subsidize their deeply entitled lifestyle, their facade of wealthy arrogance crumbled into dust within a matter of days. Beatrice narrowly avoided jail time for her actions regarding the gas stove due to a lack of definitive physical evidence proving homicidal intent, but the psychological and social damage was fully inflicted. They are currently residing in a cramped, poorly insulated one-bedroom rental apartment situated next to a noisy industrial park on the absolute desolate outskirts of the city. They have no luxury vehicles, no bottomless brunches, and no wealthy acquaintances willing to return their desperate phone calls. The elite social circle they so desperately tried to impress completely abandoned them the moment the local news outlets published the embarrassing details of their son's arrest and their own complicity in the plot to displace an elderly widower. They spend their days trapped in that tiny, depressing apartment, bitterly blaming each other for their collective ruin. They thought they were moving into a $1 million lake house to live out their golden years as royalty. Instead, their profound greed exiled them to a life of perpetual poverty and complete social isolation. They have absolutely nothing left to steal and no one left to deceive. They are forced to wake up every morning and look at the miserable reality of who they truly are. Rachel, on the other hand, has experienced a magnificent, beautiful rebirth. The extraction from her toxic marriage was the most agonizing but necessary procedure of her entire life. She stayed in the secure luxury hotel suite for a full month, completely physically protected from the chaotic fallout of Trent's arrest and his subsequent media exposure. She filed for an expedited divorce, citing felony criminal conduct and severe financial abuse. Because Trent was incarcerated and facing a mountain of federal charges, the family court judge granted her request swiftly and with absolute finality. The marital assets were meticulously separated, revealing that Trent brought nothing but massive toxic liabilities into their union. Rachel was completely absolved of his illegal debts. 3 months ago, she gave birth to a perfectly healthy, beautiful baby boy. She named him Arthur after my late father. She did not shed a single tear for the man sitting in a federal cell. She obtained full sole, physical, and legal custody of her son, ensuring that Trent will never have the legal authority to infect the child's life with his sociopathic manipulation. Rachel returned to her corporate financial career not as a hostage working to fund a parasite's least luxury, but as a powerful, independent woman securing a flawless future for her child. She visits the lake house every weekend now, not out of stressful obligation, but because it is a true haven. She looks rested, vibrant, and entirely free from the heavy anchor she had been carrying for years. The lake house itself has also undergone a profound cleansing. The very morning after the police removed the invaders, I contacted a trusted security technician. I had him methodically sweep the entire property and physically uninstall every single micro camera I had placed in the smoke detectors, the thermostats, and the kitchen valances. The surveillance protocol was officially terminated. The perimeter was secure. There were no more threats to monitor and no more hostile movements to record. The home returned to its original intended purpose as a private sanctuary. I hired a specialized crew of master carpenters to repair the massive damage Gideon and his reckless contractors had inflicted upon the back deck. They removed the shattered cedar planks and reinforced the underlying foundational joists, pouring their craftsmanship into restoring the exact structural integrity Diane had originally designed. I walked into the living room and unpacked the cardboard box Beatrice had shoved into the pantry. I took each silver-framed photograph of my late wife, polished the glass until it shined perfectly, and placed them exactly where they belonged on the stone mantel over the fireplace. Her smiling face watches over the living room once again, banishing the temporary dark energy the invaders had brought into our space. The air inside the house no longer feels tense or heavy. It smells of fresh pine, polished cedar, and absolute unmitigated peace. I am currently sitting on that newly renovated deck, sinking comfortably into my favorite wooden rocking chair. The afternoon sun is descending slowly over the tree line, painting the surface of the lake in brilliant shades of amber and crushed gold. The air is perfectly still. Resting gently against my chest, wrapped in a soft blue knitted blanket, is my 3-month-old grandson, Arthur. He is sleeping soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm. I look down at his peaceful face, feeling a profound sense of ultimate victory. I did not have to raise my voice to secure this future for him. I did not have to engage in screaming matches, throw physical punches, or allow myself to be dragged down into the chaotic mud of their emotional manipulation. When confronted with an invasion of parasites attempting to consume everything I had spent a lifetime building, I relied entirely on the cold, undeniable mechanics of logic, observation, and tactical patience. I simply provided them with the rope, gave them the illusion of absolute control, and stood perfectly still while they eagerly wrapped it around their own necks. The house is completely silent, save for the gentle lapping of the lake water against the dock, serving as a perfect reminder that the most absolute destruction of an enemy is the one they build for themselves.